I want you to picture a specific moment. It's late, and someone is staring at a screen. Maybe it's a phone, maybe it's a slot machine. The lights are bright, the sounds are perfectly engineered to sound like a near win, even on a loss. Their logical brain, the part that worries about rent and relationships, is screaming at them to stop. It's laying out all the evidence. You're down, it's not coming back, you'll regret this tomorrow. But then another part of their brain takes over. It's an older, more powerful system that doesn't speak in words, but in urges. It's the same deep-seated wiring that tells you to eat when you're starving. And right now, it's convinced that the next bet, the next spin, isn't just a desire, it's a desperate need. It tells them they can win it all back, that the big win is just one click away. And in this battle between rational thought and raw impulse, the impulse wins. Another bet is placed. That moment of override where a behavior becomes a compulsion isn't just a lapse in judgment, it's a neurochemical hijacking. What's truly fascinating and a little terrifying is that the official diagnostic manual for psychiatry now classifies that internal struggle in the exact same category as heroin and cocaine addiction. This isn't about weak willpower anymore. It's about a fundamental rewiring of the brain's core survival systems. That opening image, that moment of override, that's exactly what we're diving into today. Our mission here is really to understand that neurochemical hijacking, the huge biological and policy implications when we start treating a behavior like gambling with the same scientific seriousness as a substance use disorder.
Right.
It's acknowledging that the struggle is physiological, maybe even before it's psychological. It forces us and you listening to look past just individual choice and think about the shared vulnerability.
Exactly. That reclassification, it wasn't just, shuffling papers. It was a really profound acknowledgement that there's a shared biology underneath. So for you listening, this deep dive is about recognizing we're moving towards, what some call an addiction syndrome model. The way it shows up might be different, a drug, a drink, placing a bet, but the underlying brain mechanism, it's basically the same.
So we'll unpack that.
Yeah. Today, we'll explore what this medical shift actually means for treatment, for brain chemistry, and this is critical, how our modern world, from those betting apps always in your pocket, right down to the food we eat, how all that feeds into this shared vulnerability actually amplifies it.
Okay, let's start with the revolution itself. The DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition, came out in 2013. And this was, arguably a massive change in how we diagnose things. Gambling disorder got moved.
Right.
It went from being an impulse control disorder to this newly expanded section, substance-related and addictive disorders. That made it the first and still the only non-substance behavioral addiction, sitting alongside things like alcohol, cocaine, opiates. Why did that move from just impulse control to addiction? Why did that matter so much in the clinic?
Well, think about the words. Impulse sounds like a sort of a one-off thing, right? A temporary slip.
Yeah, like losing your temper.
Exactly. But addiction, that implies something chronic, progressive, something rooted in neurobiology and illness. And just changing that word carries enormous weight in the real world, especially for public health and crucially for getting access to treatment.
Can you give us a sort of a concrete example? How does this medical shift actually change things for someone struggling?
Sure. Let's think about someone, we can call him Michael. His life got totally taken over by sports betting. Now, before 2013, if he went for help, his severe gambling might have been classified as, impulse control disorder, maybe even just secondary to depression.
Right, not the main issue.
Exactly. So Michael might have sought help for years, but his insurance probably saw it through that limited lens. Minimal coverage, often treated more like a character flaw, a failure to just regulate himself. The new classification, it changed everything for people like him. Once his disorder was officially in the same category as alcohol and drug addiction, substance-related and addictive disorders, his doctor could make a much stronger case for comprehensive treatment.
So like residential care, things usually reserved for severe substance abuse.
Precisely. That reclassification basically forced the healthcare models to see gambling disorder as a genuine chronic illness, something needing serious evidence-based medical help. It validated the suffering and opened up real pathways to recovery pathways that were often closed off or just way too expensive before.
That really shows the power of shifting from seeing it as a moral failing to a medical disease. And the DSM-5 committee can justify that because, the diagnostic overlap is just huge, isn't it? I mean, the original criteria for gambling disorder were actually based on substance dependence criteria way back in DSM-3.
That's absolutely right. They saw the pattern of behavior was functionally the same thing. If you actually break down the criteria side by side, gambling disorder GD and alcohol use disorder, AUD, the overlap is really strong.
Okay, let's look at some examples, like tolerance.
Yeah, tolerance. For GD, it's defined as needing to gamble with more and more money, or more often, to get that same level of excitement, that same high. For AUD, it's needing more alcohol to get the desired effect, the intoxication. It's the same basic neurobiological thing. You need a bigger stimulus to get the original reward feeling.
And then the absolute core of any addiction, loss of control.
The loss of control, defined as trying repeatedly to cut down, control, or just stop the behavior and failing. That criterion is identical across both GD and AUD.
Yeah.
It shows that failure of executive function, that inability to shut down the compulsive urge. It's really the hallmark of the addiction syndrome.
What about withdrawal? That one confuses people with behavioral addictions because there isn't a physical chemical dependency, right?
Right, but withdrawal still happens. It shows how the brain comes to rely on that behavior for its neurochemical balance, for homeostasis. For GD, withdrawal means feeling restless or irritable when you try to control the gambling, or when you just can't gamble.
Okay.
For AUD, it's the physical symptoms, or using alcohol specifically to avoid or relieve those symptoms. But in both cases, the person is using the behavior, or the substance, to dodge feeling bad, that negative state.
We also see that element of preoccupation, right? Fixation.
Exactly. For GD, this fixation means intense preoccupation. Thinking about past wins, constantly planning the next bet, figuring out how to get money for it.
Right.
For AUD, the equivalent is spending excessive time getting the alcohol, using it, or recovering from its effects. In both situations, it's just consuming the person's thoughts, their mental energy.
Now, you mentioned something interesting, a potential gap in the GD criteria. AUD specifically lists craving, strong desire, or urges to use alcohol. Why isn't there a specific craving criterion for gambling?
Yeah, that's still debated clinically. The evidence is really strong that intense, intrusive cravings are common in GD. They often directly precede a relapse, and they clearly correlate with how severe the gambling is.
So why leave it out?
It's a bit unclear. The omission of an explicit craving item feels like a major gap to many. Clinically, everyone knows the urge is central. Diagnostically, it's just not there. This slight difference is one reason some researchers argue the GD diagnosis isn't perfectly aligned yet, even with the big shift.
Okay, so they line up on the core addiction concepts, but there are still some distinct bits that reflect the unique impact of a financial behavioral addiction.
Absolutely. GD has 4 unique criteria that really capture the behavioral and especially the economic fallout. These are chasing losses, that feeling you have to go back tomorrow to win back what you lost. Frequently gambling when feeling bad, using it to self-medicate or escape feelings like helplessness, guilt, anxiety. Then there's lying about how much you're gambling to family, therapists, and finally, depending on others for money, the bailouts because you're in a desperate financial hole from the losses.
It's the lying and the financial dependence that often creates that devastating public spiral you see with GD, maybe more visibly than with AUD sometimes.
Definitely. And conversely, AUD has its own unique item about recurrent use in physically hazardous situations. That reflects the immediate safety risk of being intoxicated, which is usually less relevant for GD itself, unless maybe the behavior leads to extreme emotional distress or dangerous situations to get funds.
Okay, this diagnostic comparison gets even more concerning when we look at the actual threshold needed for a diagnosis. If the underlying biology is supposed to be so similar, why does the bar seem so much higher for gambling? This feels like where the policy hasn't quite caught up with the science.
This difference is, frankly, a critical public health issue. The threshold for something like AUD, a substance use disorder, is pretty low. You only need 2 out of 11 symptoms for mild diagnosis.
Okay, 2 symptoms.
But to get even a mild gambling disorder diagnosis, you need 4 out of 9 symptoms. If you only have 3 GD symptoms, you're technically classified as having a problem, but not a disorder.
Wait a second. So if I have 3 severe life-wrecking symptoms of gambling, maybe I'm chasing losses, lying about it, and gambling when distressed. I don't qualify for an official diagnosis. But if I show just 2 symptoms of alcohol use disorder, maybe tolerance and occasionally drinking more than intended, I do get diagnosed as mild.
That's exactly right. The severity ratings are totally out of sync. Mild GD effectively starts where moderate AUD starts, just looking at the number of criteria. And this is critical because studies clearly show substantial substantial negative impacts, major problems associated with subthreshold gambling, people meeting only 2 or 3 criteria.
What kinds of problems?
These individuals still face a higher risk of other mental health issues, huge financial debt, and tragically, much higher rates of thinking about or attempting suicide.
So by keeping that diagnostic bar so high, the system is basically failing to identify and treat people who are already suffering significant harm that would absolutely get them a mild diagnosis under the SUD framework. Doesn't that kind of defeat the purpose of aligning them in the DSM-5?
It creates a huge bottleneck to getting care. If these diagnostic sets were truly consistent, patients experiencing serious harm from a behavioral compulsion, like our example Michael, would be treated just as seriously and get insurance coverage just as readily as someone struggling with a chemical dependency. The science points one way towards a unified view, but the manual keeps this numerical difference that risks downplaying real suffering.
Okay, if the overlapping criteria weren't enough proof, the data on comorbidity having other disorders at the same time, it just screams shared biology, doesn't it? We're not talking about a few odd cases here. The rates are staggering. It suggests GD isn't isolated. It's maybe a symptom of a bigger internal vulnerability.
That's the heart of the addiction syndrome idea. Comorbidity isn't the exception in GD. It's pretty much the rule. Get this, as many as 96% of people with lifetime gambling disorder also meet the criteria for at least one other lifetime psychiatric disorder.
96%.
96%. If you have GD, the odds of having something else going on are almost certain.
Wow. Just that number alone feels like it justifies the DSM-5 change. I mean, if almost everyone with GD has another diagnosis, trying to treat just the gambling seems almost impossible, right? You can't just treat the symptom if the underlying ground is unstable. That's
Precisely the challenge. And the numbers for specific co-occurring disorders are incredibly high. Lifetime rates for mood disorders, often major depression, are somewhere between 49% and 56%.
Half the people.
Yeah. Anxiety disorders are also really common, 41% to 60%. But the link to other addictive disorders is the strongest. A massive 73% of people with GD also meet criteria for alcohol use disorder, and 38% for drug use disorder.
So huge overlap with substance issues.
Huge. And the connection isn't just common, it's sort of exponential.
Huh.
Individuals with GD are 30 times more likely to have multiple, meaning 3 or more other lifetime psychiatric disorders compared to the general population.
30 times. That just screams generalized risk factor, doesn't it? Some kind of fundamental issue in the brain's regulatory systems.
And if you connect that to the bigger picture, it really suggests GD is often just one way this broader underlying vulnerability shows up. What's really interesting here is the direction it goes. Looking back, retrospective studies often suggest that other psychiatric conditions, things like personality disorders, mood problems, general anxiety, they often come first.
So they act as risk factors.
Right. People might start gambling as a way to cope, to self-medicate. But, and this is important, studies that follow people over time, prospective studies, they also show that having GD in the past year is linked to developing new psychiatric conditions later on, including new cases of mood disorders, anxiety, and AUD.
Okay, so it's a two-way street. A pre-existing vulnerability can lead to gambling, but once that compulsive gambling cycle starts, it can actually trigger or worsen other conditions.
Exactly. They feed off each other,
Yeah.
making the overall problem worse. And where does that initial fragility come from? Well, the genetics really seem to back up the idea that some people are just, well, born with a predisposition that makes them vulnerable to any kind of addiction, whether it's behavioral or chemical.
What's the actual number on inherited risk? How much is genetic?
The heritability for GD is substantial. Estimates put it between 0.5 and 0.6 year.
So 50 to 60%.
Yeah. To put that in context for you, that means 50 to 60% of the variation in whether someone develops GD can be traced back to inherited genetic factors. That puts it right in the same ballpark as the heritability rates we see for alcohol and opiates. It really demonstrates how deep that shared risk goes.
But the key thing here, it seems, is that this inherited risk isn't specifically for gambling, right? It's more fundamental, like poor cognitive control.
Exactly. A lot of that heritable risk is nonspecific. It's shared across different substances and behaviors. And this shared vulnerability seems linked to these underlying broad, measurable traits like impulsivity and negative affect, that tendency towards feeling distressed or anxious. Interestingly, genetics seems to play a bigger role in the later stages, the chronic part of addiction, that total loss of control, maybe more so than just influencing whether someone tries gambling in the first place.
Can we get more specific? Is there a known genetic link related to impulsivity?
Yeah, research has pinpointed some shared genetic markers. One that's pretty well studied is the TAC-A1 allele of the dopamine receptor D2 polymorphism.
Okay, that's a mouthful. What does it mean?
Basically, it's a specific variation in the gene that codes for a type of dopamine receptor, the D2 receptor. And this variation has been linked to both GD and AUD.
Why does that matter?
Well, the D2 receptor is crucial for regulating dopamine signals, especially in brain pathways involved in stopping yourself, inhibitory control, and processing rewards. Having this particular allele, this TAC-A1 variation, seems to be associated with changes in how many D2 receptors you have or how efficiently they work. Functionally, this might mean it's harder to suppress impulsive urges, or maybe you need a bigger hit to feel satisfied by a reward. It suggests a shared genetic tendency towards general impulsivity could explain some of the genetic overlap between these two disorders that look so different on the surface.
Speaking of impulsivity, that brings us right to the cognitive side of things. People with GD don't just act impulsively, they actually show measurable deficits in their brain's software, their executive functions.
Yeah, that's very consistent in the research. Individuals with GD show deficits in several key executive functions, or EFs. Things like decision-making, especially when risk is involved. Also, inhibitory control, basically, hitting the brakes once a behavior starts. And mental flexibility, which is the ability to switch strategies when something isn't working.
And the same question comes up here as with the genetics. Are these cognitive problems there before the addiction starts, acting as a risk factor? Or are they a consequence of the addiction?
The evidence suggests it's probably a bit of both. There's strong support for the idea that premorbid impulsivity that exists beforehand is common across the broader addiction population. It seems to be a significant risk factor. Self-reports, lab tasks, they consistently show higher trait impulsivity in GD.
Okay.
However, the data also suggests an important difference. Chronic substance use, especially long-term heavy drinking and alcohol dependence, might cause greater impairment in certain EFs like working memory or how fast you process information compared to GD.
So the substance itself might add extra damage.
It suggests that while impulsivity might be a shared inherited risk, the chronic exposure to something neurotoxic like alcohol could lead to more severe substance-specific damage to the brain's prefrontal circuits than the behavioral addiction alone might cause.
Okay, let's pivot now to the brain's engine driving a lot of this. Dopamine. When we look under the hood, the mesocortical limbic dopamine system is central to pretty much all known addictions. For gambling disorder, it's thought the dysfunction in this dopamine system leads to things like increased anticipation of rewards and maybe a heightened sensitivity to uncertainty, which sounds like perfect fuel for a betting compulsion.
Yeah, and the sheer power of dopamine in driving these specific kinds of behaviors was maybe most dramatically and kind of unexpectedly confirmed by looking at a totally different group of patients, people with Parkinson's disease.
Right, the Parkinson's link. That feels like one of the most compelling pieces of evidence supporting that DSM-5 shift.
Absolutely. There's a small but clinically significant group of Parkinson's patients who, when they were treated with certain dopamine agonists, these are drugs like pramipexole, ropinirole that boost dopamine, often hitting the D3 receptor quite strongly, they started developing pathological gambling or compulsive shopping, hypersexuality, other impulse control problems. These behaviors often came out of nowhere and were absolutely devastating for the patients and their families.
So doctors were treating a movement disorder, something physical, and accidentally triggered a severe behavioral addiction. That's like a real-world causal experiment. It just clearly shows dopamine's direct role in hijacking the circuits that control our impulses and addictive behavior.
This really stark warning, but also a very clear biological signpost. And it led researchers to look intensely at the brains of people with GD using imaging like PT scans and fMRI. Now, the PT scan results, looking at dopamine receptor density, they're a bit inconsistent across different studies.
Okay.
But some interesting differences related to dopamine release have popped up.
Like what are the specific findings linking more dopamine activity to how severe the gambling is?
Well, one key finding involves amphetamine-induced dopamine release. Basically, they give a stimulant and measure how much dopamine the brain releases, kind of showing its capacity. It seems this release is greater in a part of the brain called the dorsal striatum in gamblers compared to controls. And crucially, how much greater that release is correlates directly with how severe their gambling symptoms are.
Interesting.
Other studies suggest dopamine release is really tied to the excitement of uncertainty, and it gets triggered by the act of gambling itself, especially in games like slot machines with lots of near misses and unpredictable payouts.
But the fMRI studies looking at brain activity in real time, they show something subtle, but maybe really important, where GD differs from substance use disorders. What does that tell us about how the gambler's high actually works?
Yeah, this is where it gets really fascinating. Meta-analyses, looking across many fMRI studies, show that both SUD groups and GD groups have decreased activity in the striatum during reward anticipation compared to healthy people.
Okay, so their brains are already sort of understimulated, looking for a kick before the reward even happens.
Kinda, yeah. Primed and maybe deficient in some way. But here's the twist. During the actual receipt of a reward, the moment you win, people with SUDs often show an increase in brain activity, that bold D signal. It signals the positive chemical payoff.
Right.
But individuals with GD, they often show a paradoxical decrease in bold activity when they win. The payoff seems disappointing, neurologically speaking.
Oh, wow. That difference is huge. So the brain of someone with alcohol use disorder registers the reward of the drink, but the brain of someone with gambling disorder barely registers the reward of the win itself. It sounds like the whole reward system got rewired to prioritize the buildup, the chase.
Exactly. The chase really is the drug in GD. The anticipation, the near miss, the uncertainty, that's where the main neurochemical action seems to be concentrated. This kind of unique neurological signature makes GD fundamentally different from a chemical addiction in how the reward itself is processed. It reinforces the behavior by driving the cycle of chasing the excitement rather than actually enjoying the outcome.
This mechanism brings us right back to that core cognitive trait we keep mentioning, impulsivity. If we accept this failure of executive control, this impulsivity, as the central endophenotype, the measurable biological vulnerability, then how do we actually target it?
Well, impulsivity is something we measure a lot using behavioral tasks. We generally define it as that tendency to act right away, often in a way that messes up long-term goals. A really common way to assess this is using intertemporal discounting tasks.
Okay, what's that?
It's where you give someone a choice. Do you want a smaller reward right now, say $20 today, or a larger reward later, maybe $30 in a month? People with GD consistently show a much greater tendency to pick the smaller, sooner reward. They discount the future value much more steeply.
So they strongly prefer immediate gratification, even when it's objectively less valuable or irrational financially. Can we actually change that preference with drugs?
Yes, and this really helps validate the biological basis. Studies using pharmacological manipulation show that giving L-DOPA, which is a precursor to dopamine, actually increased impulsive choices in healthy control subjects doing these discounting tasks.
So more dopamine availability made healthy people more impulsive in that specific way.
Exactly. It suggests the state of the dopamine system directly influences how impulsive your choices are, or maybe how much you value future outcomes versus immediate ones. And knowing this opens the door, potentially, to using certain drugs, maybe ones that modulate dopamine, to try and increase how salient those long-term goals feel compared to the immediate urge.
This really sounds like the cutting edge, moving towards targeted therapy. Let's maybe use an example to make it concrete. Imagine a young student. Let's call her Chloe. She started betting on online slots to cope with exam stress. Let's say traditional talk therapy, CBT, hasn't really managed that overwhelming physical urge she feels when she just opens her phone.
Yeah, Chloe's situation perfectly highlights why we need personalized treatment. GD is so varied, it's really a syndrome. So treatment probably needs to be stratified, tailored, based on these intermediate cognitive factors, like her level of impulsivity.
Yeah.
We have to move beyond one size fits all.
So for someone like Chloe, what might that look like?
Well, we could look at novel therapies.
Oh.
For instance, remember how dopamine agonists sometimes cause GD in Parkinson's patients, possibly by overstimulating D3 receptors?
Right.
A logical next step, then, is to test D3 receptor antagonists in GD patients. The idea would be to specifically dampen that potentially overactive impulse pathway.
Okay, so that's one pharmacological angle. What about using technology? Can we teach the brain to control itself more directly?
That's where something like neurofeedback comes in, and it could be really promising for cases like Chloe's. Neurofeedback is basically a behavioral treatment where you learn to consciously regulate your own brain activity, specifically the circuits involved in craving or impulse.
How does that work? She's hooked up to a machine?
Yeah, typically. She might be connected to an EEG or maybe even an fMRI scanner while doing some task. And she'd get real-time feedback, maybe a visual display like a bar graph or a game on a screen, showing her own brain activity. Perhaps showing the activity in her reward circuits versus her inhibitory control circuits.
So she literally sees her own brain firing in real time. How does seeing it help her control it?
Exactly. She learned through trial and error, through operant conditioning, how to change that signal, how to, say, quiet down the part of her brain associated with craving, or maybe boost the activity in her prefrontal cortex, her control center. She learns what mental strategies make the bar go down or the game character move correctly.
Oh.
It moves treatment beyond just talking about the urge, the psychological aspect, and gets right to the physiological root of that impulse control problem.
Yeah.
For Chloe, learning to actively quiet that craving signal in her brain through this real-time feedback could be teaching her brain, quite literally, how to override the impulse itself.
Okay, so we've laid out the internal vulnerability, the genetics, the dopamine issues, but these vulnerabilities, they aren't operating in a vacuum, are they? They're being pushed, maybe to the breaking point, by our modern environment. The threat today just feels ubiquitous. You've got this explosion of legal, easily accessible gambling 24/7 on your phone, hyper-personalized ads, all seemingly designed perfectly to exploit that very neurobiological weakness we've been talking about.
It really is a perfect storm.
Yeah.
The environment is just engineered for constant reward, immediate gratification. But to really grasp the full picture of this systemic vulnerability, we need to look at what else in our modern world might be messing with our cognitive control. And that brings us to something fascinating: the gut-brain axis.
The gut-brain axis. Okay.
It's this biochemical superhighway, this constant communication network, connecting our central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, with our enteric nervous system, the complex network of nerves in our gut, sometimes called the second brain.
How exactly does the gut talk to the brain? How can what's happening in my stomach influence my impulse control or make me more vulnerable to addiction?
It's a complex two-way street, mostly using chemical signals. A huge part of the communication relies on the vagus nerve. Think of it as the main physical cable connecting the gut and the brain. But we should be clear, the vagus nerve is mostly sending signals up from the gut to the brain.
Reporting on the situation down there.
Exactly. Reporting on the state of the microbial community, inflammation levels, things like that. Then you also have immune pathways. Signaling molecules called cytokines, produced in response to inflammation, can actually cross the blood-brain barrier and directly influence brain function, affecting mood and behavior.
And the microbes themselves, the bacteria in our gut, they're actually making neurochemicals.
Critically, yes. The gut microbiome is like a massive chemical factory. Consider this. Up to 95% of the body's total serotonin, which is absolutely vital for regulating mood and anxiety, is produced in the gut. And its production and availability are heavily influenced by the types of bacteria living there.
Wow, 95%.
Yeah, and gut bacteria also produce other neuroactive molecules like GABA, which promotes relaxation, and they influence dopamine levels too. So the state of our internal ecosystem directly impacts our mental state, our mood, and yes, our impulse control.
That creates a really direct link then between what we eat and how vulnerable we might be to addiction. If our gut isn't healthy, our brain is likely less resilient.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that leads us to this powerful diet addiction nexus.
Yeah.
Probably the single biggest environmental driver messing with this internal balance is the modern Western diet. High in ultra-processed foods, UPFs, refined sugars, saturated fats. And these UPFs, they aren't just empty calories. They are literally engineered for hyperpalatability.
Engineered to be addictive.
Essentially, yes. They provide this rapid, potent hit to the dopamine reward system, very comparable to how addictive drugs work.
We need to really emphasize that. We're talking about genuine physiological parallels here, not just cravings for tasty food.
Absolutely. Research into food addiction shows that chronic consumption of these UPFs leads to the classic signs of addiction. Tolerance needing more and more to get the same pleasure and actual withdrawal symptoms when you cut back. Things like irritability, anxiety, headaches. There are animal studies, famous ones, showing rats will often choose sugar water even over intravenous cocaine. It shows how intense sweetness can hijack the reward circuitry, sometimes even more powerfully than a known addictive drug.
Okay, let's try and view this through the lens of someone like, say, Mr. Tanaka from our sources. Maybe he relied on quick, processed meals to fuel a high-stress job and used visits to the pachinko parlor down the street to unwind, to cope. His diet and his gambling weren't separate issues, were they? They were probably fueling the same neurochemical fire.
Mr. Tanaka's hypothetical situation is a perfect illustration of the biological cascade that could make him vulnerable to that slot machine, whether it's physical or on his phone. A sustained diet heavy in Western-style processed foods likely causes gut dysbiosis. That's an imbalance in the gut microbes, where the beneficial bacteria get crowded out by pro-inflammatory types.
Okay, dysbiosis. What does that lead to?
This dysbiosis promotes chronic, low-grade neuroinflammation. It's not like an acute infection, but a constant simmering inflammation throughout the body and, importantly, the brain.
What happens when the brain itself is inflamed like that, even at a low level?
Chronic inflammation impairs the prefrontal cortex, PFC. That's the brain's CEO, the executive control center. It's responsible for suppressing urges, regulating emotions, making long-term plans. Think of chronic inflammation as constantly throwing static or interference into the brain's highest level processing.
So it makes it harder to think clearly, harder to resist impulses.
Exactly. Yeah. The result is heightened trait impulsivity and a stronger preference for immediate rewards that exacerbates the intertemporal discounting we talked about earlier. You become less able to wait for the bigger payoff later.
So the very control center in our brain that's supposed to help us resist temptation is being chemically weakened by the food many of us eat every day. That just sounds like a setup for failure when faced with the engineered temptations of the modern world. It sounds like a vicious cycle.
It is the ultimate vicious cycle. A poor diet weakens the PFC. A weakened PFC makes it harder to make good long-term choices, including dietary ones, so maybe you reach for more convenient, processed comfort foods.
Right.
That causes more inflammation, which further suppresses PFC function. And the resulting brain state, less top-down control, more susceptible to immediate rewards, is perfectly vulnerable to the rapid feedback loops and high-reward cues of modern gambling. The constant availability, the personalized nudges from online betting apps, it's all hitting a brain that's potentially lost some of its natural defenses due to environmental factors like diet.
And since the PFC is in charge of all executive functions, not just resisting gambling, but financial planning, emotional regulation, focusing attention, the degradation of this system must have wider impacts, right? It's not just about gambling. It could affect general societal functioning, decision-making overall.
Absolutely. The same impulsivity that might drive a disastrous bet or lead someone to need a financial bailout is rooted in the same generalized cognitive impairment that could drive poor impulsive shopping decisions or maybe inappropriate emotional outbursts in an argument. It's the same weakened control system. Furthermore, there's emerging research suggesting the gut-brain axis is also involved in modulating social behavior, how we process fear, even social cognition, how we understand others. This starts to raise some really serious questions about the cumulative societal impact if large parts of the population are experiencing chronic, low-grade cognitive impairment.
That's a huge potential implication. If a significant portion of the population is walking around with, let's say, suboptimal PFC function, partly due to diet and inflammation, what are the speculative consequences for us collectively, for our society?
Well, think about roles that demand high levels of executive function. Effective parenting, for instance, requires enormous emotional regulation, planning, impulse control. How might widespread diet-induced PFC impairment affect the next generation's environment and development? Or even think about civic life. Evaluating complex policies, resisting emotional manipulation or fear-mongering in political discourse, all that requires a healthy PFC. A population with generally degraded executive function might be inherently less resilient, more susceptible to short-term thinking, emotional appeals, and overly simplistic solutions. The biological state of our collective gut could, in a very real way, impact our ability to function as rational, future-oriented citizens.
Okay, let's bring it back to treatment now. But armed with this whole picture, the shared neurobiology with SUDs, the environmental context, the gut-brain connection. Despite all these neurobiological links to substance use disorders, are the treatments actually developed for SUDs proving effective for gambling disorder?
Well, behaviorally, they're definitely the foundation. Things like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, 12-step programs like Gamblers Anonymous, GA, even bibliotherapy, guided self-help. They're widely used and often really helpful for people with GD. They build directly on models that have been successful for alcohol and drug problems. These therapies aim to help restore that cognitive control the PFC is struggling to exert.
Right. But what about when we move to pharmacological interventions, the actual medications? The results for GD seem, well, pretty mixed, don't they?
They really are. We have a significant challenge here. Even though treatments are often based on the SUD models, the clinical trial evidence for drugs in GD is, frankly, mixed. And the certainty of the evidence we do have is often rated as low or even very low.
Why is the evidence so shaky?
A big part of it is due to small sample sizes in many studies, but it's also a critical methodological issue. Many trials systematically excluded participants who had the very high rates of comorbidity like depression or anxiety that we know are typical of the actual GD population seen in clinics.
Okay, so let's break down the drug categories. Which ones, if any, show the most promise, even with those caveats?
The opioid antagonists seem to have the most consistent positive signal. These are drugs like naltrexone and nalmefene. They work by blocking opioid receptors, which are definitely involved in the brain's pleasure and reward pathways. Across several trials, they showed what's considered a medium beneficial effect on reducing the severity of gambling symptoms compared to a placebo.
That makes sense, right? If gambling involves a release of natural opioids during the anticipation or the high, blocking those receptors should dampen the reward.
Exactly. And crucially, these drugs also seem to have an added benefit. They reduced co-occurring symptoms of depression and anxiety. This suggests they might be having a more generalized calming effect, maybe targeting that underlying negative affect that often drives the behavior.
Okay, so opioid antagonists look somewhat promising. What about antipsychotics?
The atypical antipsychotics, specifically a drug called olanzapine, also showed a potential medium beneficial effect on gambling symptom severity in trials compared to placebo. But, and this is a big but, this finding is based on very low certainty evidence, coming from just 2 small studies. It's also worth noting one of those studies focused specifically on video poker players, so maybe not generalizable. And antipsychotics, while they act on multiple systems including dopamine, they come with well-known side effects, metabolic problems, significant weight gain, which really limits how suitable they are long-term, especially for a non-substance disorder.
Right. Okay, let's talk about the drugs most commonly used to treat all that comorbidity we discussed, the antidepressants.
Yeah, for antidepressants like the SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and NDRIs, norepinephrine dopamine reuptake inhibitors, the overall evidence showed no superior efficacy over placebo when it came to reducing gambling severity itself.
That feels really counterintuitive. If depression and anxiety are so common in GD, why wouldn't drugs that treat those conditions help with the gambling too?
It really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? It suggests the core addiction mechanism in GD might be driven more directly by dopamine and impulse control circuits, rather than just serotonin levels. So while SSRIs might help lift someone's mood, they might not directly target the underlying impulsivity or the dopaminergic dysfunction that fuels that immediate urge to bet.
And that exclusion problem you mentioned earlier.
Yes, and that's a huge caveat here. Remember, many of these antidepressant trials specifically excluded people who had comorbid mood disorders or high levels of depressive symptoms.
So they tested the drug on the patients least likely to represent the average person with GD.
Pretty much. Since the vast majority of real-world GD patients do struggle with co-occurring mood issues, these trial results tell us very little about whether antidepressants might help the typical person seeking treatment for gambling disorder. We just don't have good data there.
Okay. And finally, what about mood stabilizers? Drugs like lithium or topiramate?
Mood stabilizers and anticonvulsants like lithium and topiramate were also found to be no more effective than placebo, both for gambling symptoms and for co-occurring psychological symptoms.
So summing up the drug landscape, it sounds like there's limited support overall, mainly a signal from the opioid antagonists. The big takeaway seems to be that treatment really needs an integrated approach, tackling the biology, the behavior, and the very common comorbidities all together.
Absolutely. The future of effective treatment has to involve addressing both the gambling behavior itself and those underlying neurobiological drivers, especially the chronic impulsivity plus the high rates of psychiatric comorbidity that fuel the whole cycle. We really have to treat the entire system, not just focus on the one compulsive behavior that's most visible. #outrap.
You know, this whole deep dive, starting with that DSM-5 reclassification, it really forces us to conclude that addiction, especially in our modern world, isn't just a substance problem anymore. It's fundamentally a brain function problem. It's a struggle for cognitive control. And that struggle can be biologically triggered by our environment just as powerfully, it seems, as it can by an addictive drug.
Yeah, the evidence really points that way. Our environment, from that incredibly sophisticated digital slot machine designed to keep you hooked in your pocket, right down to the ultra-processed food on our plates, it feels like it's systematically creating and exploiting a fundamental vulnerability in our brains. Those pathways governing impulse and reward, they're just under constant pressure, leading to this kind of neurochemical chaos. So the solution, maybe it's not just about individual therapy or finding the right medication. Maybe it needs to be a broader, more systemic effort to actually reduce the biological vulnerability that seems inherent in modern life. We need to think about defending the integrity of our own neurobiological systems. The evidence suggests that achieving control over a behavioral addiction like gambling requires more than just willpower. It may require defending the integrity of your prefrontal cortex against the pervasive influence of the modern environment, recognizing that our ability to plan our financial future is, in part, determined by the health of our gut.